Okay, this is our last session, and I'm very happy to chair it. And our first talk today, not first today, but first in this session, is by Natalia Slioussar and Natalia Cherepovskaia. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Morphological Ambiguity in Sense Processing Evidence from Russian.
Thanks a lot for having me here. And first of all, let me give some background for the talk. The background are experiments on agreement attraction. So together with several MA students of mine, we are doing like a whole range of experiments that touch on gender, number, and case agreement. And so today I will focus on a couple of these experiments, but to understand kind of the whole experimental background they rely on, I first want to introduce some facts that we know about agreement attraction. So agreement attraction was first noted in English in the 19th century already. We know that in English we have frequent mistakes like the path to the monuments are littered with bottles instead of is littered. So initially people were looking at naturally occurring mistakes in spoken and written corpora, but since 1990s there were a lot of experimental studies of this phenomenon. And the same pattern was also found not only in English but also in other languages like German, Dutch, French, Italian, Spanish, Russian too. And not only in this subject-predicate agreement, like the example I have just demonstrated, but also in other constructions. For example, like this one on the slide, the hypothesis, in plural, one entertain, influence visual information search. So the word hypothesis influences the agreement inside the relative clause that depends on the word hypothesis. So, and there are other examples studied in different languages. And first, people tend to make these mistakes in production. Both, like they can be elicited experimentally and occur naturally in corpora. And there is a parallel phenomenon in comprehension. People fail to notice the very same mistakes that tend to arise in production. And there is a lot of research on that too. And just to give you an idea of the experimental techniques that people use to study these mistakes, not to focus on that again when I will discuss different studies that other people did and that we did. So in production, like the most widespread method is as follows. So participants are presented with a subject phrase, for example, like the key to the cabinets, and are asked to complete the sentence. For example, if we have a subject phrase with no number mismatch, like the key to the cabinet, agreement mistakes in the predicate are extremely rare. But if we have this particular type of mismatch when the head of the noun phrase is in singular and the dependent noun is in plural, there are a lot of agreement mistakes. So another technique to elicit these mistakes in production is kind of less natural, but it usually gives more errors. So in this technique, participants are presented with a predicate, for example, was rusty or were rusty or to be rusty, and then with a subject phrase that doesn't always agree with it, for example, the key to the cabinets, and then they are asked to combine them in one sentence and to pronounce this sentence aloud as soon as possible. So, and in comprehension, the usual techniques are employed. So sentences with different types of errors are studied in self-paced reading studies. And then there is a localized time difference between agreement attraction errors and other errors in EEG studies, and then there is a signature pattern of evoked potentials, and also in acceptability judgment studies too. And then again, there is a difference between agreement attraction errors and other agreement errors. And so now let me focus on like a lot of different factors were studied in connection with this agreement attraction phenomenon, and I will only focus on the ones that will be important for the experiments that I am going to present. So the first important finding is the plural markedness effect. So it was shown for English and for all other languages that were studied in this respect that there are more mistakes in the sentences like one, than in the sentences like to. So if the head of the subject noun phrase is singular and the dependent noun is plural, there are a lot of mistakes, and if the head is plural and the dependent noun is singular, there are very few mistakes, so the number of mistakes is comparable to the number of mistakes without agreement attraction. And of course, this phenomenon is interesting primarily because it allows us to say something about representation of features. So, for example, how are singular and plural represented so that plural can interfere with agreement and singular cannot? For example, like when people just looked at English, they were making hypotheses like maybe singular is not marked at all on the words like path. And plural is marked, and this is why plural interferes and singular doesn't. And we are exploring this problem in a series of experiments that I will not present here. We are looking at Russian gender, where it is much less obvious what can and what cannot be marked on the noun. So another important thing that I'm going to rely on is that it was demonstrated in many different types of experiments that what matters here is the syntactic structure, not the linear order. So initially when the phenomenon when people first noticed these mistakes in English, so they thought that the verb just agrees with the closest noun phrase. But then in numerous experiments it was demonstrated that the phenomenon is structural in nature, and in a couple of minutes I will present different approaches. But so far let me just demonstrate that this is the case. So for example, if we take sentences like 3 and 4, the inscription on the doors to the toilet or the inscription on the door to the toilets, there are more mistakes in sentences like 3. So the closer the dependent word is to the head of the subject noun phrase, the more mistakes we have. And moreover, and this might be much more striking, there is no difference between sentences, for example, like 5 and 6. Are the helicopter for the flights safe? And the helicopter for the flights are safe. So in the 5th sentence, the verb is actually actually closer to the head of the subject noun phrase than to the interfering dependent noun, but still the number of mistakes is the same. And there were many other experiments also pointing into this direction. And some studies show that some linear distance effects are present too, but in any case they are much smaller than the structural effects. And the third factor, the third important thing that I am going to rely on is the formal resemblance factor. So in English you can't test for that, but once people started looking at other languages, and first of all at German, they noticed that if a potential intervener looks like a subject, the number of mistakes is significantly higher. So here there are two examples in 7 and 8. So in 7, die Stellungnahme gegen die Demonstrationen, the position against the demonstrations, the dependent word, the demonstrations, is an accusative, and it coincides with the nominative plural form. In example 8, die Stellungnahme zu den Demonstrationen, the position on the demonstrations, den Demonstrationen in dative plural does not coincide with nominative plural. Very few mistakes in 8, a lot of mistakes in 7. And now let me go to the questions that were asked in connection to all this data, and the questions in particular that I am going to address in the experiments I am going to present. So the first question is what are the mechanisms of agreement attraction? And here are two main approaches. So the more widespread approach is that it's a matter of how the syntactic structure is represented. So more or less, this is the idea of the approach. So usually in the normal situation, when we have a subject noun phrase or any phrase, it is marked, like the whole phrase is marked by the features of its head. But the proponents of this approach assumed that sometimes a phrase can be erroneously marked by the features of a dependent phrase inside this phrase. And another type of approach that is less widespread so far is the proponents of this approach claim that this can never happen in natural language, so this is not the way natural language works. And that where the error arises is like they have a very different idea about how the error arises. So they think that it's the matter of how the constituent information is accessed. So more or less, the subject noun phrase is correctly marked as singular because its head is singular. And then when we produce or when we comprehend, we predict that the verb should be in singular too. But if we encounter a mistake in comprehension, or we can also erroneously generate the wrong form in production, we start rechecking. So why is this plural form here? And then this is when the mistake happens, because if we have a plural noun phrase active inside the big subject noun phrase, this plural noun phrase can interfere with the rechecking process. So we see this plural thing, and we more or less decide that that wasn't an error. Everything is fine. And it works both in production and in comprehension. So the two approaches, as you can see, are quite different. So, and the bigger questions that these approaches address is, more or less how the syntactic structure is built in real time, so how features are represented, what they can or cannot do, so can features from a dependent element percolate up to the whole phrase, or this is impossible, and how particular grammatical forms are predicted and how rechecking works if our predictions are violated. So just to explain why this is interesting, because this is interesting for me, I work on that, but maybe if you haven't seen this data before, that is not so obvious. So, and the second question that I'm going to address is how does morphological ambiguity influence this whole process? So, here, in this approach, it's more obvious that than in that approach, because if the form looks like a subject, apparently it's easier to be fooled during rechecking. But then the question that we actually need to answer is, what do we see in the syntactic structure at this stage? Because if we are in any theory of grammar, where we have things like late insertion, where the surface forms actually are generated at a kind of late stage, then we do not expect the speaker or the hearer to have access to this surface form during the building of the syntactic structure. And the second thing, the second kind of bigger question that we can address by looking at how this rechecking process works is how paradigms are represented in the mental lexicon. Because if we look at this whole debate, not from the point of view of psycholinguistics, but from the point of view of theoretical morphology, if you look at modern theoretical morphology, actually theories that do not believe in paradigms whatsoever, like derivational morphology, are now more widespread than theories that do believe in paradigms. So here, this hints, this is better for paradigmatic approaches. So paradigmatic approaches, it's easier for them to explain this kind of rechecking mistakes, but still, again, we can derive some knowledge from here about what in particular paradigms do and how we access paradigms from the syntactic structure and so on and so forth. Yeah, let me skip this. So, and let me present the experiments. So, there were some previous studies on agreement attraction in Russian, and the first experiments that I'm going to talk about are about number. And previous studies that looked at number agreement in Russian, they looked at only at accusative plural forms coinciding with nominative plural forms. So same thing as in the German examples that I demonstrated above. However, in Russian we have more interesting types of ambiguities. So in particular, we have forms like, for example, деревни from the word деревня, village. And for this word, genitive singular form coincides with nominative plural and with accusative plural. So as you can see, the genitive singular, it coincides with nominative plural and with accusative plural, but doesn't share the plural feature with them. So in our first experiment, we wanted to compare subject phrases like 1 and 3. So things like bilet na концерты, ticket for concerts, and the word concerts is in accusative plural coinciding with nominative plural, same as in the German experiments above. Things like комната для вечеринки, room for party, and the word party here, it coincides with the nominative plural, but does not have a plural feature inside it. And things like комната для вечеринок, room for parties, and the form is in genitive plural. It shares the plural feature with the nominative plural, but does not coincide, the surface form doesn't coincide with the nominative plural. And actually, what we got, so yeah, I guess I will just present the results without going into the finer details. I have them on the slides. If you have any questions, then I can go through that later. What I got was that people make more mistakes with the subject-noun phrases like 1. Then come subject-noun phrases like 2. And people almost do not make any mistakes with the subject-noun phrases like 3. So the surface form coinciding with the nominative plural turned out to be more important than actually having the plural feature inside this dependent noun. And if we come back to these different approaches to agreement attraction, this approach cannot explain these facts whatsoever, because this approach relies on features from a dependent element being able to get to the head of the subject-noun phrase. Here, a word вечеринки in the genitive singular has no plural features inside it whatsoever. Then only this approach is left. And for this approach, it means that either during this rechecking process, we have access to the surface form, which would be surprising for many approaches to morphology, where morphology comes rather late in the grammar architecture. Or an alternative explanation would be that when this form is generated, it activates homonymous forms in the paradigm, and thus actually makes not only its own feature set available, but also kind of partially activates other feature sets that this form can correspond to. And this is what we see during the rechecking process. So in any case, kind of the picture turns out to be quite different from what people initially thought, but we haven't decided yet. So I favor this last option myself, but we haven't actually decided yet whether, which one is the correct one. So, let me skip the details. So then another series of experiments that I wanted to say a couple of words about were on a very different type of mistake. So on case ambiguity. So some Russian adjectives are ambiguous for case. So in, I give some examples here, but in particular, for example, genitive plural coincides with prepositional plural for all genders. So here I give some examples. Без известных актеров in genitive plural. So, and this form, известных, is also used in prepositional plural. Об известных актерах. And just to give you some other control example, this is the dative plural, к известным актерам, two famous actors, and this adjective form does not coincide with genitive plural and prepositional plural. And so Here we have some corpus data. It's always nice when you see the mistakes, not only in the experiment, but also in the corpus. And here we do have some corpus data. So these mistakes, Marina Rusakova, who studied naturally occurring errors in Russian, she noted the existence of errors like two. В тех размеров, so in those genitive plural coinciding with prepositional plural, and sorry, it has actors, but it's actually sizes. So the sizes come in prepositional plural instead of the genitive plural that is required by the preposition. So in our project, we wanted to compare such case errors to other case errors, and we started with comprehension first because we knew that these errors occur in production from Rusakova's work, and also because we were not sure from the very start whether we would be able to elicit how to elicit such case errors. But actually, there are people here in the audience working with me who did manage to do that. So we will have production studies too. So we looked at examples like two, embedded in subject DPs. I have a couple of examples here. So, неудачи в прошлых сезонах, failures, nominative plural, in previous seasons, prepositional plural, compared to неудачи в прошлых сезонов, failures, nominative plural, in previous, prepositional plural, coincides with genitive plural, seasons, genitive plural, and control condition, the dative plural, failures in previous prepositional plural, seasons, dative plural, and this adjective form does not coincide with dative plural. And what we got was that participants notice our case errors later and slow down on them less than on other case errors. So this was the first self-paced reading study. This is what it looked like approximately, so let me just show on one diagram. So this is the correct genitive plural form. This is the prepositional plural instead of genitive plural. And this is the dative plural instead of genitive plural. So people slow down on prepositional plural much less and later than on the dative plural form. So then we wanted to see whether this effect actually depends on the linear distance between the adjective and the noun. Because from the very start, I had a feeling that it's similar to agreement attraction. And agreement attraction is known to be independent from linear distance. And in fact, this difference was also visible when three words were inserted between the ambiguous adjective and the noun in the wrong case. And an example is given in 4. So the leaves on the going along steep banks, these three words between the participle and the word path that comes in the right case or in the two wrong cases. So we saw that the phenomenon does not depend on linear distance, so it was visible both in the short and in the long sentences. And we actually concluded that it's similar to agreement attraction. And then we also conducted a third experiment where it was a speeded grammaticality judgment with same short and long sentences as in our second experiment. And we could see that people miss our case errors more often than other case errors. And the difference was significant only in the long sentences. And it's interesting to note that online effects were more pronounced in the short sentences, and offline effects were more visible in the long sentences. So apparently the short sentences were easier to read, so people reacted to both our errors and other errors more. Longer sentences were in general more difficult to process, so people reacted to all types of errors less. But then you could see the difference in the accuracy of the grammaticality judgments. So people missed in general much more mistakes, and the differences between different types of errors grew accordingly. So here are some examples. So, for example, in the long sentences with prepositions taking genitive, people missed 37 mistakes if the wrong noun was in the prepositional case, and 22 mistakes if the wrong noun was in the dative case, and the differences between these conditions are significant. So, and if we come back to different approaches to agreement attraction, so this approach actually, for this approach it was crucial that this is a noun phrase and this is also a noun phrase, and that those features can percolate from a wrong head inside the noun phrase. So what we see with our adjectives and nouns is a kind of absolutely different configuration. So an adjective that interferes with the agreement between interferes with the noun having the right case. So more or less interferes between the link between the preposition and the noun. It's not a head. And so in no way you can say that the noun receives its case from the adjective or looks at the adjective to check its case or whatever. And so apparently if we, so this gives us a whole new perspective on the phenomenon, because more or less in this other approach where we encounter or accidentally generate a wrong form and start rechecking, we can look at all kinds of things, not necessarily like at heads, and we look at this ambiguous adjective, and if indeed the ambiguous form activates other forms in the paradigm, other feature sets in the paradigm it coincides to, it also activates the wrong case features. And this is why we tend to miss the mistake on the noun much more often. And to wrap up, there are actually, I presented kind of the very general results, but there are a lot of questions that we have left and that we are going to address in our further experiments. For example, in our online self-paced reading experiments, all effects were more pronounced for preposition selecting genitive. And at first we could not understand why. And we also tried looking at case ambiguity with singular adjective forms. And apparently this is due to the higher frequency of the genitive forms, because we could replicate these effects with different cases in the singular paradigm. Then another big question that we can't answer so far is as follows. So if you look at standard agreement attraction, there are a lot of mistakes in English, a whole lot of mistakes. So even if you take a kind of writer's reference to write an essay in English for a native speaker, they would mention these mistakes that you should watch out for them. In Russian, even if you control for morphological ambiguity, there are very few such mistakes, I mean the subject-predicate agreement mistakes in the corpus. But we have a lot of these case mistakes. So it's very interesting to understand why. So how Russian syntax works and how English syntax works in real time, so that we make lots of mistakes here. So they're very easy to find in spontaneous speech, easy to find in a corpus. And we make very few subject-predicate agreement mistakes, even if you control for morphological ambiguity and trace only the cases where the dependent noun inside the subject noun phrase is ambiguous. So there are lots of very interesting questions that we haven't addressed here so far.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions, please. I'm sure there are questions.
Yeah.
Oh,
I have a little question. I remember reading a corpus study of English in which they reported an incredible amount of phrases like I says in English. I can't tell you the frequency right now, but it was absolutely incredible, but it was also
No, as far as I know, it's a different phenomenon. So if you look at these mistakes, so more or less, corpus studies of these mistakes work as follows. So people identify all these complex subject noun phrases. So maybe the corpora where people say I says, maybe they produce kind of few complex subjects. So maybe this is kind of very, kind of more, I don't know, less complex syntax. So, but if people produce a lot of those, then what you do, you actually count the number of wrong verb forms depending on the number of the head and the number of the dependent noun. And actually, in this agreement attraction, yeah, if the head noun is singular and the dependent noun is plural, you can have up to 15% of mistakes for these constructions. While for other cases, say singular, singular, plural, 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 singular, you have something like 1%. So it's a dramatic difference for English. But I'm not sure how, yeah, how many I says cases would be in those corpora.
I think it's the Corpus Grammar of English, 1999.
Yeah, so what I want to stress here is that they kind of, they reason about the incidence of such mistakes comparing kind of similar constructions, which I think is crucial here because, yeah, because at least these are things of comparable complexity.
Okay, there was a question right here.
My question is whether there is a correlation between the lexical features of the head nouns and the frequency of mistakes. For instance, if noun can be construed as collective.
Ah, okay, sure. Yeah. Yeah, I got the question. Yeah. Yeah, so this question was actually, very well explored for English. They were comparing phrases like the baby on the blankets, the most salient interpretation being one baby sitting on a pile of blankets, and the label on the bottles, the most salient interpretation being one label per bottle. And you know, the results, they diverge. So in some studies, this distributivity played no role. In most other studies, it did play a role. And then people were also looking at more kind of fine-grained semantic stuff. For example, whether the integration between the head noun and the dependent noun, semantic integration, like a pizza with yummy toppings and a pizza with tasty beverages, whether that would play a role. And in the study that explored these particular pairs, yeah, it did play a role. So, yeah, people were looking at that a lot in English. We didn't look at that in Russian because we wanted to look in Russian for something that people haven't done in English yet.
All right, we'll take one more.
Yeah.
Yes. First of all, about I says, I don't know whether the database was based on British English. In American English, this is actually a norm for uneducated or regional variants, and people like to play with it. You know, when you want to lower the register, you would say I says, and it's certainly very marked, but it's not ungrammatical in that sense. Now, about Razmerov, just wanted to note that in the literature on second language acquisition and on child acquisition, this is number one substitution error in the corpora for children and second language learners. So there is some salience and some pervasiveness to this error. Just to
yeah, and it's extremely interesting because actually this error, at least, yeah, we haven't really explored that so far, but this error exists in, say, child language corpora, but the opposite error when you substitute prepositional, prepositional for genitive. I saw it kind of much more rarely, but in our experiments, kind of both errors
Right, because this is your materials, you're pushing for them, you're setting them up.
Yeah, so we expected, we kind of expected a difference between them because actually this type of error is more often found in learner's corpora and in child language corpora. The other type of errors is not, but in experiments they behave kind of similarly. So I was always wondering whether the phenomenon has the same source, partly the same source, or actually different sources. So we haven't answered this question so far.
Do you have 1 more minute? This is about something that has to do with your dichotomy of representational problems and processing problems. We had a presentation by my colleague in my department who was reporting a study where they correlated sensitivity on a self-paced reading task with working memory capacity. And they found a very interesting negative correlation. The better the working memory capacity, the worse the sensitivity became. So it is like if you remember too much, you get more confused. You're better off forgetting. The bottom line is that when you're talking about this representation, we are used to saying the representation is there, the representation is not there, but maybe it's more useful to say how robust is the representation, how you can tweak with it. Thank you.
Yeah, here, I totally agree.
Okay, thank you very much.